root causes of human trafficking is that there is a lot of a lack of awareness in our community about what human trafficking looks like, how it occurs. You know, there's a lot of myths that a person needs to come from another country in order to be trafficked, or needs to be moved from one place to another, or that this only happens to people who don't speak English or who aren't born in the United States, when in fact that's not true. When we look at the cases that we have prosecuted here in Santa Clara County, we found that in sex trafficking cases, a majority of the victims are U.S. citizens, speak English, often are young, anywhere from 13 years old to their mid-20s. And so this doesn't really fit in the demographics that most people think and kind of you know, assume when it comes to sex trafficking. Now, when it comes to labor trafficking, it's what we've seen is the victims are typically not U.S. citizens, they're undocumented, English is not their first language, and they tend to be older, in their 20s to 30s and 40s. So what we at the District Attorney's Office feel is very important is to go out into the community to educate, to train people, law enforcement, volunteers, so that they are aware of the red flags, the signs, the things to look out for, and also so that they really understand what human trafficking looks like in our county. And what we've seen is that by educating the community and training on the red flags, we've gotten people reporting and giving law enforcement tips on suspicious circumstances, and that's really key in rooting out human trafficking.
Some of the root causes of trafficking are a great lack of awareness that of where trafficking is being done. We often think of trafficking as just happening out of the country, but that is not true. It is happening right here. A young girl can be trafficked by reading an ad that says, "Do you want to be a model?" She says she does, and so she writes in, and eventually she's lured into either the pornographic industry, and oftentimes we think, you know, that these people are held captive, and it's not necessarily the case. But what happens is, like, the young girl who wants to be a model ends up doing pornography, and she doesn't want to continue, but she has been taken either to another city that she doesn't know where she's at. She's not given any money. She has to repay the person who is holding her, who is coercing her, who is forcing her to do these kinds of sex acts. She's being held there because of lack of money, lack of awareness of where she lives, and lack of papers she can't get from one place to another. And she also then becomes indebted to the person, and so she's held there really psychologically.
So why is this happening in the United States? We are a developed country. We are considered, you know, civilized people. Well, we know recently that we are lacking in understanding the human dignity of persons, whether that is African American persons, Latino persons, people of Muslim religion. Anyone who is considered less a person and is treated that way can become a potential victim of human trafficking. So there is exploitation here in the United States for the reasons that we've mentioned before: greed, making money, and not treating people with equality. And whether or not it's in an airport, whether people are treated in terms of screening, whether people are treated poorly in police situations, we know that the United States has a definite problem in terms of treating people equally with human dignity, and that is why trafficking can happen here.
The trade has been going on and has been undercover. People have been deceived to get better jobs, but in actual sense, there are no better jobs. However, someone will say that it is because of poverty, but that is not the reality about human trafficking. Human trafficking is you desire to go and have something better. You are deceived to find a better life elsewhere. Then you fall prey to the traffickers. So I would, and the major cause or the root cause of this vice are the traffickers themselves, because they use a lot of trickery, a lot of deceit, and at times coercion to get the victim to wherever they want him or her to be. So lack of awareness in our communities has led the human trafficking to continue. Even when people are aware, they really feel there is something better for them to do. That when you go out of your country, for example, to Abu Dhabi, you find a better job, which better job can still be got in a country like Uganda. Another issue I'll talk about is about blaming the victims. You find that we have refugees coming in, and these have been embraced. And the person who has been trafficked out of the country, out of their home, when they return back home, they have been blamed for all that has happened to them. Men have been abused sexually, and they're not welcomed back into the community. They're being nicknamed. So it keeps them away from the community. They are not able to, they're not in position to come out and share their ordeal. Maybe through sharing, we could be able to curb the vice. So the lack of the social way of welcoming them back home and handling them has led to the vice being continuous. Another issue is disparities in terms of the women and the men, the gender disparities. You find that the women in Uganda have been vulnerable for quite some time. They don't own property. Whereas they may have access to land, they don't own the property. They don't own the produce from the land that they are tilling. So in the end, they imagine that going and seeking better employment somewhere else maybe would make them better. But in actual sense, it does not do any good. In actual sense, you find that when they go, they are being used as domestic workers in the home with lots of work, or further still as sex workers, which is more demoralizing and causing them more vulnerability.
So another root cause of human trafficking is this belief on the part of the traffickers that trafficking a person is high profit and low risk. And what I mean by that is, you know, a trafficker can make a lot of money selling a young girl or forcing a woman to engage in prostitution and then take all that money. Or an employer can make a lot of money cutting corners and running his or her business and then not pay his employees fair wages. And you know, trafficking is often compared to selling drugs or selling weapons. You know, once you sell a drug, the product is gone, but a person you can sell many times over. So that is a root cause in why trafficking persists. And you know, one of the ways that we're trying to turn that on its head is to hold these traffickers accountable, to say, hey, you know, greed is going to be punished. If you are caught by law enforcement, if you're convicted and we investigate your case and we're able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you're guilty of this crime, the California legislature, our voters have instilled or have created very stiff penalties for human trafficking violators. And so in the past 10 or 12 years, we've seen the prison sentences become much longer for traffickers. So we're hoping that when we're able to prosecute these cases and send out a message that traffickers will be held responsible for their conduct, that equation of high profit, low risk is hopefully no longer becomes a root cause.
Say the barriers to seeking assistance, some of them are pretty obvious, like why doesn't somebody self-report? They're foreign national, they don't speak the language, and they don't have the ability to report what's happening. And maybe they come from a country where you would not trust law enforcement, and so there's not even a consideration to report what's happening here in the United States to law enforcement here. There's a lot of different barriers. I think one of the ones that I see that's really strong, that's pretty consistent with my clients, is the shame and the stigma, whether it's their family or to their elders or the church or the community. Never underestimate that shame and stigma. Even if we're talking about a survivor that's been out of the life for 20 years, that's still a part of their identity. And it's very powerful not to want to disclose and come forward and tell anybody what's happened, or even attempt to get out of the situation, because with all that shame and stigma, they tend to feel there's no hope. And that's exactly what the exploiter wants them to think. And that's how the exploiter is able to manipulate them, is because feeding into that shame and stigma.
One of the things when we talk about the United States and trafficking here in the United States, and why is it happening, there are lots of homeless kids, and those are the ones that are being trafficked. A runaway can be trafficked within the first 12 hours that person has run away. Foster kids are often trafficked, and we do not know that. Foster kids, the social workers, if they don't go to the home on a regular basis, can be being trafficked by their foster parents. So those are two groupings, and usually they are women and children that are being trafficked in those situations. Any area of poverty causes trafficking to happen because there's need of money, and so therefore the children and teenagers are being trafficked. It was interesting that in North Carolina there was a story of a young woman who came from a very affluent family but left her family to go find her way in Nashville and in Charlottesville, not Nashville, Charlottesville, and while there did not have enough money and then became trafficked, and she entered into sex trafficking. So again, someone who leaves a good situation, is trying to make her mark, and then ends up being trafficked.
Well, the root causes of human trafficking or child trafficking in our society are first, poverty. Most of the families are living in the fishing community, and they don't really have all the means to take care of their kids, as many as they are. So yeah, definitely poverty plays a huge role, because they need money to cater for themselves and take care of the kids and other stuff. And also the second factor would be ignorance or naivety, because some of them don't really know that their kids are being sent out on the Lake Volta, where we have most of child trafficking happening. And they probably, after some while through our community engagements, they find out that, oh yeah, I believe my kid is there, and they come and report to us, and we do all that. So yeah, the community is pretty, the Ghanaian community in general is pretty naive about child trafficking or human trafficking. And the third factor, obviously, is the high profit and low risk, because it takes them literally no money to get a kid from a family to the lake. It could take as less as 50 Ghana cedis, which should be something around $10, just to have a kid from their families to the lake, and to work as many years as possible until maybe challenging heights drop in to save the kid. The fourth factor, should be maybe weak implementation of policies from the government side, whereby we don't do much to take care of that, or to cater for the children that are being sold into trafficking. Like the past 2 years, we've been on the Tier 2 watch list, and we were unable to prosecute any slave masters or anything like that. And we have a lucky break. We had a lucky break by staying more into Tier 2 kind of thing, but I should think by the end of this year, if there's nothing that's been done so much, we could have ourselves been withdrawn to a Tier 3 watch list, whereby we lose about $600 million, and that's going to affect the whole Ghanaian economy. So overall, I think those are pretty much the 4 substantial reasons for human trafficking or child trafficking in Ghana.
We all know that gender plays a great role in most areas of life, and there is complete inequality when it comes to the issue of trafficking. women and children are most vulnerable, and so they are the most victims of trafficking. Gender inequality as a part also of the breakdown of a family. If there is a family tradition where the male is prominent, oftentimes the female, the woman, or the child is also part of an abusive situation. And so, unfortunately, that is the case with at least 50% more women and children are trafficked than boys and men.
There are several causes of trafficking, and trafficking is probably one of the most complex issues happening globally right now, because it plays at this intersection of cultural norms, kind of different stratas of society. It preys on vulnerabilities of different populations. So the root causes are similar but can be different depending on geography and the type of trafficking. But some things that come into play are kind of cultural norms. So if we talk about child sex trafficking in the United States, the fact that in this country we have a population of men who buy sex enables the trafficking of children. Because if that part of our society didn't exist, traffickers would not be able to make money and therefore would not traffic children. So the cultural norms that come into play are very important. If you look at labor trafficking, the fact that as a global society we are constantly looking for lower and lower prices on products and products to be made very quickly. That's corporate pressure, that's stock market pressure. That's meaning that supply chains are constantly looking for the most, often the cheapest labor. Until this is starting to change, but until we as consumers demand that there's more responsibility in those supply chains. Also, kind of the stratification of our society of kind of highly vulnerable populations is one of the root causes as well. So those populations who do not have access or opportunity or options are often very vulnerable to trafficking, and that can be for children or adults in commercial sex in the United States, and that can be people looking for work. So when traffickers go into other countries and make a promise of a job overseas or in another country, they are preying on people who are actively seeking work because they have no other options where they're at. Displacement, so large refugee or migrant populations are at risk as those displaced people are seeking some type of settlement. That also comes into play as a root cause of trafficking. Also, one of it could be a root cause or an issue that makes trafficking worse is, I think, a misunderstanding, especially when it comes to sex trafficking, of who the victim is and what the dynamics are in play in the issue. So until recently, often, especially in the United States, children were arrested when they were found in prostitution. That has changed dramatically over the last decade, where now in most states that does not happen, but you still have law enforcement and prosecutors and judges who don't fully understand kind of the mental control that pimps and traffickers have over their victims, and that these children are victims, and that the focus should be put on the demand side so that you can actually disrupt the marketplace. So several different factors at play, a very complicated issue, and that's why it's so important to have so many parts of society, NGOs, government, business involved as part of the solution. So a third root cause is victim blaming, or the idea that victims don't come forward and report the victimization. And this can be a problem in several respects. One is that when it comes to human trafficking, the act of exploitation itself is illegal. So the act of exploitation, sex trafficking, prostitution, that act is illegal. And so that already is a barrier that keeps victims from coming forward, because they think that if I go to law enforcement, I'm going to get in trouble for engaging in prostitution. The same goes with labor trafficking. if a person is undocumented and working in the United States, that victim won't come forward if they're being taken advantage of because they think that they'll get in trouble for working in the United States illegally. So what we are trying to do is assure trafficking victims that we're not interested in you know, convicting them of prostitution charges if they're doing this as a result of being trafficked. We're not interested in deporting workers who are being exploited in the United States because they're working here without authorization. We want to reassure these victims that we want to go after their exploiters. And so that comes with education, training, outreach. And that's why it's so vitally important that we do all those things in order to get the message out. You know, another way that this can be a root cause is when the victim comes from, you know, a broken home or, you know, a low socioeconomic status. A lot of these things are risk factors, and oftentimes we have to look at what is causing a victim to become vulnerable. And this is related, but you know, it's not victim blaming, but it's slightly related to the fact that, you know, a lot of these victims are coming from vulnerable backgrounds and situations, and so we have to address those vulnerabilities if we want to protect them from traffickers.
Another way that our society contributes to trafficking, and we are completely unaware that we're doing this, is the kinds of products we buy. We'll go to a store and something looks really great, and so we go and we purchase it, not knowing that maybe the sweater that we just got was made in a country by little kids who are doing this because they either were sold to the person who is making the clothes, or else that they need to pay back money for their family, and so that's why they're working there. So we need to look to, there are apps that are available where we can check the different kinds of products and whether they're made in a company that deals in a fair way with the people who are employed there. We can also, there's lots of fair trade products that they can go to places, a million stores, I think it's called, a million villages sells fair trade products. So if you just even go on the internet and look for fair trade coffee, and now they have a new thing for diamonds, because we all know that diamonds are oftentimes, they exploit the environment and they exploit the people, but now there is a new industry here in the San Francisco Bay Area that has the technology to create real diamonds without exploiting people or exploiting the environment.